You're listening to Romancing in Paris on Paris Underground Radio.
Hello, and welcome to the Romancing in Paris podcast. I'm your host, Lily Heise. In this podcast, we'll be traveling around the city as I pick out my top romantic spots per arrondissement. You don't have to visit these places only as a couple. Exploring them can be the expression of your own love of Paris. Are you ready to get romancing in Paris? I hope you've enjoyed the last few episodes when we covered the first circle of the left bank districts for a second time. Before we hop back over the Seine River to the right bank, I thought we'd take an even bigger jump. Actually, a much bigger jump beyond the boundaries of Paris than our first detour outside the city limits, the episode in which we covered a romantic castle near Paris, the Chateau de Malmaison. This time, instead of just one chateau, we're going to be visiting several in France's heartland of turrets and towers. Grab your chérie. We're going to tour the most romantic castles of the Loire Valley. Located around a 2-hour drive south of Paris, the Loire Valley is one of the most idyllic regions in France, made all the more romantic by its hundreds of castles. Like all over the country, castles have been built in the Loire for over 1,000 years. However, the grand heyday of Loire castles was during the Renaissance, in the 16th and 17th centuries. This all started when King Francis I brought the Renaissance to France up from Italy, applied via the architecture and the art of its sumptuous chateaux. The pinnacle of the era was Le Château de Chambord, an impressive royal residence famed for its symmetry, towers, and double helix staircase. While Chambord is spectacular, as are countless other castles of the region, they aren't all necessarily romantic. Therefore, I've shortlisted a selection of chateaux that are both romantic in setting and in their true essence, which is found at their very core. Famous lovers' hideaways, royal mistress demures, and lovely gardens. These castles are all perfect to include in a romantic weekend or an even longer trip to the Loire. Pack your bags. Let's travel down to the Loire together. The first castle we'll be discussing is also one of the area's oldest, the Cité Royale de Loche. Clinging to a rocky outcrop overlooking the Indre River Valley, Loche was built between the 11th and 16th centuries. Encircled by ancient fortifications, the castle complex includes one of the best preserved medieval keeps in France, as well as a more elegant newer castle. As of 1418, Loche became a favorite residence of King Charles VII. It was the location where Jeanne d'Arc came to meet the king in 1429, after the victory of Orleans. Be that as it may, the castle is now famous for a different woman in Charles VII's life, Agnès Sorel. Nicknamed La Dame de Beauté, or the Lady of Beauty, when Agnès, or Agnes in English, was around 20, she became a maid of honor to Elizabeth de Lorraine, the Duchess d'Anjou. She then became a lady-in-waiting for Queen Marie d'Anjou, the wife of Charles VII, who had fallen under the beauty's charm. Oh la la! This was in 1443, and the king was 20 years her senior. Charles was so taken by La Belle Agnès that she was given the title of the official mistress of the king, making her the first to be given this title, a subject we've discussed on other episodes of the podcast, including numbers 14 and 20. Agnès was known for taking great care of her beauty. She used daily creams and wore makeup. Her beguiling looks were also thanks to her wardrobe. Agnès was particularly known for her elaborate and low-cut gowns. Oh la la, Agnès. But Agnès wasn't only all about her beauty. She was also very clever, which allowed her to have great influence over the king, and she became one of his closest advisors. In return, the king granted her several castles, including le Chateau de Loche. Over their 7 to 8 year relationship, Agnès also bore the king 4 daughters, the last of which sadly died around the same time as Agnès, who passed away shortly after giving birth. Agnès didn't die in child labor, though, and her death is still cloaked in mystery. Some have hypothesized that she was actually poisoned, and potentially by Charles' eldest son, the future Louis XI, out of jealousy of Agnès' closeness to the king. Poisoned or not, poor Agnès, she certainly didn't deserve to die at such a young age. Agnès has been immortalized in numerous paintings of the era as well as since then. She was a character in Voltaire's La Pucelle and in other books by famed French writers. While you're in Loche, you can pay homage to Agnès at her final resting place in the collegiate church Saint-Ours. But before we leave Loche, I have one last interesting anecdote. Agnès' 3 surviving daughters were legitimized by the king and married to important noblemen, one of whose sons became the husband of Diane de Poitiers, the famed mistress of another king, Henry II, which just so happens to bring us to our next castle. Oh, Diane de Poitiers, another legendary beauty, but this time of the next century. Listeners of my other podcast, Paris Cachée, might recall that she came up briefly in episode 3 on La Courtie Barbette. I won't give you a full bio on Diane. That would take up a whole podcast episode, or maybe more. Instead, I recommend you visit the Chateau de Chenonceau to learn more about her. The castle is one of the most renowned of the Loire, thanks to its awe-inspiring design, spanning the Cher River, and its fascinating history linked to a number of influential women. These did not start with Diane, but instead a noblewoman called Catherine Biconnet, who began converting a medieval fortress, one tower of which still exists, into an elegant Renaissance-era chateau as of 1513. Falling into royal hands, Henry II gave his favorite mistress this castle in 1547. It was Diane who decided to add on the castle's most iconic feature, its bridge over the Cher River. She also created an exquisite garden lying at the edge of the river. When Henry II died tragically in 1559, one of the first things his widow, Catherine de' Medici, did was snatch up Chenonceau from Diane. Catherine created her own gardens and tried to outdo Diane by further developing the gallery above the river, as well as redoing some of the interior's decor. When Catherine and Henry's last son, Henry III, died, also tragically, in 1589, his widow, Louise de Lorraine, retreated to Chenonceau to mourn. Later on, the castle was saved from destruction during the Revolution by yet another woman, Madame Dupin. In addition to this fascinating feminine history, you will certainly fall under Chenonceau's fairy tale allure. From the moment you walk down its tree-lined lane to reach it, touring the sumptuous interiors, whose opulent rooms include paintings by famed master artists like Rubens, Correggio, and Tintoretto, you can imagine staying at the castle yourself back in those times, enjoying a lavish ball in the gallery, savoring an extravagant feast, or pulling the curtains around one of those beds in the uber-romantic bedrooms. Oh la la. After visiting the inside, walk hand in hand with your chérie through Chenonceau's various gardens, or make a game of it by trying to find each other in the labyrinth. You can finish your visit with tasting some of the estate's wine at its cellar. The castle truly has all the makings of a perfect chateau visit. If it's gardens you like, then you can't skip out on the Chateau de Villandry. Also the site of a medieval fortress, the estate was bought by Francis I's finance minister, Jean Breton, who converted it into a Renaissance castle. A future owner, le Marquis de Castellane, had a jardin à la Française created behind the castle in the 1760s. Not surprisingly, in the aftermath of the Revolution, the 19th century wasn't so kind to the castle nor to its grounds, which were transformed into an English-style park. However, in the early 20th century, the estate was bought by Joaquim Carvalho and Anne Coleman, who strove to restore the Renaissance gardens using historic documentation. Their dedication and efforts live on to this day. Visitors to the chateau are treated to a bucolic stroll around this verdant masterpiece, whose romance is enhanced by its love gardens. Found the closest to the chateau, the Andalusian-style gardens are comprised of 4 sections, each representing a different type of love: tender love, passionate love, flighty love, and tragic love. Themes which are depicted via flower beds and box hedges in the shape of hearts, flames, daggers, and more. Whew, oh la la, who knew gardens could be so sensual? Which love will yours be on your visit to Villandry? There are also plenty of romantic nooks for cuddly lovers' moments, plus pathways through the woods for a more discreet stroll. It would be hard to speak about romantic chateaux in the Loire without mentioning another one set upon water, Heise-le-Rideau. The quintessential fairy tale castle was started in 1518 by another of François I's finance ministers, Gilles Berthiaud, and his wife, Philippa, who oversaw the castle's construction. This story had all the makings of a fairy tale ending for the couple at their regal residence. However, Berthiaud was accused of misappropriating state funds and had to abandon the castle and flee in 1527. The unfinished castle became the property of the king, who then gifted it to Antoine Raffin, one of his knights-in-arms, whose family owned it until the eve of the French Revolution. In 1905, it was purchased by the French state, who gradually restored the then dilapidated castle back to its previous glory. Its more intimate size allows visitors to feel right at home and project themselves too into this fairy tale, I hope with a happy ending.
If you're enjoying this episode of Romancing in Paris, you may also like to listen in to our sister podcast, The Heart of You, an engaging show about spirituality and divination. Romancing in Paris will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now back to Romancing in Paris.
Located only 2 kilometers from Heise is a lesser-known castle with connections to famed lovers. Regular listeners of the podcast might have caught my little reference to what was to come in the previous episode, number 30, on the Rodin Museum. Auguste Rodin and his lover, muse, and fellow sculptor Camille Claudel used the Château de l'Islette as their lovers' retreat. The lovely Renaissance castle is set upon the Indre River, making it the perfect place for the fervent artistic couple to live out their passion. There was also some work done in between their romancing. In this serene setting, Rodin was inspired for one of his chefs-d'œuvre, the colossal sculpture of Balzac, and Camille Claudel created La Petite Châtelaine, the role which Camille seemed to be playing here at the castle. You can see a copy of her sculpture while visiting Islette. Picnics are allowed on the grounds, so plan to visit at lunch with your own supplies or some acquired from the castle shop. So many castles, so little time in one podcast episode. We might have to return to the Loire another time. I'll include some practical information about these venues on my website, jetammeneither.com, which will help you plan the perfect romantic trip to the Loire. You can also find plenty of other ideas for romantic outings on the site. Thank you for listening to this latest episode of Romancing in Paris. If you have a minute, please rate or review it, which will help attract other future listeners. If you would like to support the network, please see our Patreon page, which has a range of cool extra content, events, and more for its members. Until next time, happy romancing in Paris.
This episode of Romancing in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.